I heard you like drawing starters. So, for starters, I started letting you draw starters so you can start drawing starters with your starters to start your turn. But it would be a shame if you bricked. Welcome to Lesson 4 of the Mind Crush Masterclass, where we capture and unveil all the core YuGiOh principles that are both
timeless and universal.
Past, present, or future, these principles will always be significant and develop your ground game. In this lesson, you will learn about the Law of Diminishing Returns. More specifically, you will learn the two fallacies that harbor diminishing returns in your deck. If you have not learned Mind Crush Lesson 3 on 40 versus 41, then you are doing yourself a disservice, as we make references to how one card can impact your deck throughout this lesson. You may have a difficult time understanding what we're talking about, so learn Lesson 3 first, pinned in the upper right corner of your screen. Ground gamers, if you listen right to the entire lesson, we've got a bonus just for you.
It's time to
think macro. In economics, the law of diminishing returns predicts that after a certain level of capacity is reached, adding an additional input will actually result in smaller increases of output. For example, let's suppose you are watering a tree by yourself. You are providing labor, where you are the only input and fruits are the only output. Watering the tree by yourself only produces 2 fruits as output. When you add a second input, let's say another laborer, you both together produce 7 fruits as output. You now believe if you keep increasing your input, you will get even more output. So now you decide to add a third input, let's say a third laborer. The 3 of you together are now only able to grow 6 fruits instead of more than 7. Too much water kills the tree. This is the law of diminishing returns, and this law exists in YuGiOh deck building under 2 different fallacies. For the following fallacies, treat the cards in your main deck as inputs and the impact of each card as outputs. The first fallacy is the belief that maxing out ratios is always the correct approach. A common example is deciding to main deck 3 sci-frame gear gamma and 1 sci-frame driver, where the input is equal to gamma and the output is equal to both the desired and undesired impacts that gamma brings to your deck, which is either the ability to draw a brick or the ability to negate the activation and destroy an opponent's monster. Every duelist that decides to main deck sci-frame gear gamma hopes to resolve gamma in an offensive capacity on their turn. That is the best case scenario, because they can then link or synchro summon with driver as material to unbrick the second and third gammas remaining left in their deck. Hope is not a plan. The best duelists in the world are comfortable with being uncomfortable. They are prepared for worst case scenarios. So let's address the worst case scenario. What if you resolved gamma in a defensive capacity on your opponent's turn? If you did, your 1 sci-frame driver will probably be banished in the end phase, rendering your remaining 2 gammas as bricks that you will eventually draw into in the foreseeable future. But let's dive deeper. 1 input offers you 2 outputs, 1 desirable and 1 undesirable. You love the desired output so much, but you do not see it happen often with 1 input alone. So you had a bright idea. You increase consistency by trying to optimize your hypergeometric distribution, and you figured 3 gamma and 1 driver is best. While it is true, you will see your desired output much more frequently. Under the law of diminishing returns, your returns diminish significantly after the first gamma resolves. This phenomenon occurs everywhere in Yu-Gi-Oh! Remember, the first fallacy is the belief that maxing out ratios is always the correct approach. This is a fallacy, because this is not always the correct approach. There are other approaches that are available on the table, but many refuse to acknowledge them. The first approach is the worst option, which is to add more targets in your deck to prolong the inevitability of bricking. But usually these targets themselves are more bricks. The second approach is to eliminate diminishing returns by reducing inputs to optimize outputs. The law of diminishing returns predicts that after a certain level of capacity is reached, adding an additional input will actually result in less returns. Such is the case for Pot of Prosperity. This is a card that everyone tends to max out at 3 in their main deck. When drawn, most duelists utilize this card to its fullest return by banishing 6 cards from their extra deck. If you adopt this plan every time you see Pot of Prosperity, you will have 3 cards remaining in your extra deck. Realistically, most duelists tend to summon at least 1 monster in their extra deck per duel. We know this to be true because if special summoning from the extra deck was not a priority for the duelist, then Pot of Duality would be the superior choice over Pot of Prosperity. If you do summon at least 1 monster with 2 cards remaining in the extra deck, the third Pot of Prosperity would become a brick. The third approach is the best, but also the most difficult. Use critical thinking. Examples of thinking critically are finding alternative use applications for bricks, such is the case for Gem Knight Amber into Thunder Dragon Colossus. While this does not solve our diminishing returns dilemma with the second and third copies of Brilliant Fusion, this does render 2 out of 4 of the cards as non-bricks. A second example would be finding a way to obtain value from the cards banished under a third Pot of Prosperity. The third pot would still be a brick, but cards you decide to banish become integral for your deck's strategy, which is a far greater return than running 2 Pot of Prosperity. The diminishing return is then justifiable in this niche scenario. A third example of using critical thinking is main decking 2 Emergency Teleport, knowing in full anticipation that 1 Gamma will be used defensively as a worst case scenario, while E-Tele can unbrick the remaining 2 Gammas out of the deck. Just do not make the mistake of running 3 emergency teleports in this circumstance. The second fallacy is the belief that you must have the same line of play every single end board turn 1. Nonsense. This is a fallacy in Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck building, because if you designed your deck to successfully execute your end board every turn 1, it will render the rest of your deck rudderless without an alternative strategy to win.
So by playing these instead of like adding terraformings or metaverse to get to Lair of Darkness, you get like multiple different lines of play that don't do the same thing. So you don't get diminishing returns.
You should strive to build your deck as consistently as possible for the purpose of card accessibility, but it should not be consistent in strategy. Understand and know the difference. Consistency in strategy is an inconsistency in adaptation. As the saying goes, if you want a better life, you need to make better choices. And you cannot fathom all the choices available to you unless you are first willing to let go of limiting beliefs. This is a limiting belief. There is no one strategy that is potent for every single matchup. Build your deck as a toolbox, consistently accessing any card you want. But make sure all cards do not depend on one another, let alone one common strategy. The following deck is an example of this fallacy. This Tri-Brigade Sprite deck has 8 bricks, 0 other, 14 disruptions, 6 extenders, and 13 starters, among 10 of which can also become extenders, alongside 4 additional starters in their extra deck. According to this design, the ideal hand is 2 starters, 2 disruptions, and either 1 brick or 1 extender. This deck is designed to be a toolbox, built to be highly consistent in card accessibility. The Tri-Brigade engine can access the Sprite engine, and the Sprite engine can access the Tri-Brigade engine, all thanks to Gigantic Sprite and Sprite Spring. There is only one evident strategy: to end on Pit Knight early, double Dragon Lords, and IP Masquerena with Tri-Brigade Revolt and Sprite Smashers set, or a variation of this. This is an exceptional end board turn 1, and it can be achieved consistently due to Gigantic Sprite and Sprite Spring. However, let's presume this duel will proceed after this end board is successfully established. Let's presume this end board has been overcome successfully. The rest of the main deck, in its entirety, begins to experience diminishing returns, in that every card drawn moving forward is a card with a function dedicated to establishing the board that was once established. This deck's one strategy is akin to a very sharp blade. It is a formidable weapon, but with a blatant weakness: graveyard dependency. 10 out of 41 cards in the main deck, alongside 2 out of the 4 starters in the extra deck, depend on accessing the graveyard. This exposure across the board prevents accessibility to 2 of the 5 cards, the Double Dragon Lords and Revolt namely, and a less optimal Sprite Smashers set to banish from hand instead of the graveyard. So here's the question: does this deck's graveyard dependency, exposure to diminishing returns under fallacy 1, and exposure to diminishing returns under fallacy number 2 imply that this is a bad deck? The answer is absolutely not. In fact, the exact deck list came in the top 8 in the 2023 YuGiOh 250th YCS in Los Angeles, piloted by Hissam Jahari. But what this exposure does imply is that there is room for further improvement mathematically. It is optimized under hypergeometric distribution, but it is not optimized for reduced diminishing returns. While you can always max out your deck in ratios of 3 to achieve an optimal hypergeometric distribution, your deck will suffer under the law of diminishing returns after your plays have been exhausted. 2 opposite sides of the same coin, 2 opposing properties within similar parabolic functions. Will you prioritize low variance, or will you prioritize a high output elasticity? The choice is yours. Thank you for listening. If you have received value from today's lesson, punch the like button, subscribe, and join our community located down in the top pinned comment and in the description box below. As a bonus, exclusively for the real ones, here at Ground Game we took the time to dissect and break down slot allocation. If you want access to Lesson 5 in advance to take your ground game to the next level, just join us on Discord, comment your Discord username below, and type @Kozaki in the Mind Crush series Discord channel. Only matching usernames in the comment section and Discord channel will receive the next lesson in advance. That's game. GG.
Mind crush!
Stand your ground.